When you think of world wars, you probably imagine the two conflicts that shaped the first half of the 20th century. Yet a little more than 150 years earlier, in the middle of the 18th century, the world witnessed the outbreak of what can probably be regarded as the first truly global conflict in human history. In almost every corner of the earth, from Europe to North America and the Caribbean, and all the way to India, the nations of Great Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Spain, Sweden, and Portugal, together with countless Native American and Indian allies, fought to decide who would not only maintain the balance of power in Europe, but also rise to become the dominant colonial power on the world stage. This chain of events, which lasted from 1756 to 1763, caused old alliances to collapse and new powers to gain importance. But how could a small skirmish over a territorial dispute on the American frontier escalate into the world's first truly global conflict? This is the story of the 7 Years' War. The causes of the 7 Years' War lay in the results of earlier conflicts of the 18th century, which set the two great dynastic powers of the time, the Bourbon kings of France and the Habsburg monarchy of Austria, against one another. During the previous 50 years, each side had tried to assert its dominance over the continent and shift the European balance of power in its own favor. In the most recent conflict, the War of the Austrian Succession, which was fought from 1740 to 1748, the belligerents had aligned themselves according to the long-established alliance system that had shaped European politics during the late 17th and early 18th centuries. France's traditional enemies, Austria and Great Britain, had joined together as they had done on previous occasions and were supported by German electorate of Hanover, which was ruled in personal union with Great Britain under the Georgian kings, as well as by the Dutch Republic and Russia. On the other hand, Prussia, the leading anti-Austrian state in Germany, allied itself with France and was supported by Spain and Sweden, as well as Saxony and Sardinia, although the latter two would later change sides. The war itself was largely inconclusive, since it was fought over who should lawfully inherit the Austrian throne, which ultimately remained in the hands of Empress Maria Theresa. The only notable territorial change was the wealthy province of Silesia, which passed from Austrian hands into those of the Prussian king Frederick the Great. Although the war ended in 1748 with the signing of the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, it failed to resolve many of the underlying tensions between the signatories, and in many ways it created further points of dispute through the agreed peace terms. But by 1756, the alliance system of the previous 50 years had begun to dissolve. Anti-British sentiment had gained ground at the imperial court in Vienna after tensions arose over London's demands for the protection of Hanover, and Vienna's counter-arguments for the protection of the Austrian Netherlands against any future French aggression. In addition, Maria Theresa was furious over Great Britain's acceptance of the territorial losses inflicted on Austria under the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. This led Austria to break its alliance with London and, surprisingly, to develop closer relations with its traditional enemy, the French king Louis XV. The Dutch Republic, no longer threatened by France because of the Franco-Austrian alliance, no longer had to act in Great Britain's interest and therefore never declared itself neutral. But King George of Great Britain now needed a continental ally to protect his Hanoverian lands from future French threats. And so he turned to Prussia under King Frederick the Great for support. A secret alliance was concluded between the two, under which Great Britain would provide Prussia with financial assistance in exchange for Prussia's commitment to defend Hanover. Conversely, Prussia's strategic goals were to protect its claim to Silesia and to expand its territory farther east toward the border of the Russian Empire, which was ruled by Empress Elizabeth. In response to the prospect of Prussian aggression, Russia maintained its alliance with Austria in order to counter the threat posed by Frederick the Great. This diplomatic revolutions shifted the European balance of power in new ways, which would ultimately lead once again to the outbreak of war. These political tensions, however, were not limited to Europe alone. The 18th century had seen a dramatic rise in the colonial ambitions of many European powers, but in none more so than Great Britain and France. These two nations would fan the flames of conflict across the world wherever their overseas interests collided. On the Indian subcontinent, both the British and the French had already established their respective East India companies in order to trade in the region's highly prized spices, textiles, and luxury goods, which were shipped back to Europe, where they could bring in a fortune. Although they were officially founded as trading companies, they served to project British and French influence by proxy throughout the region by winning the favor of local Indian rulers and, where necessary, enforcing their trading activities through military force. Both companies had raised their own private armies, consisting of local Indian soldiers as well as imported European troops, and these forces were used extensively in a series of conflicts known as the Carnatic Wars. These localized conflicts often overlapped with officially declared wars in Europe, such as the recent War of the Austrian Succession. But in North America, the greatest friction between the two colonial powers was felt, and it was there that the first shots of the 7 Years' War would ultimately be fired. For well over a century, Great Britain and France had established their own rule over the continent, which by the middle of the 18th century had grown into several prosperous colonies. The British had concentrated their efforts along the east coasts, with the 13 colonies stretching from Georgia in the south to Maine in the north, as well as the recently acquired Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland, which France had ceded in an earlier conflict. The French, meanwhile, claimed a vast stretch of land that included the St. Lawrence River, the Great Lakes, and much of the Mississippi Basin, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. The exact borders between the two respective possessions were poorly defined, but the French were determined to prevent British settlers from pushing westward, and therefore built a chain of forts, mainly in the Ohio Valley, in order to reinforce their claim to the area. The most disputed of these fortifications was Fort Duquesne, built in 1754 on the site of present-day Pittsburgh. The British initially tried to resolve what they saw as a violation of their territory by peaceful means. But after their protests fell on deaf ears, they decided to send a small number of colonial troops together with Native American allies to drive the French out by force. The commanding officer of the expedition was a 22-year-old lieutenant colonel in the Virginia Regiment named George Washington, who would later become the first president of the United States of America. Washington's men marched near Fort Duquesne, where, on May 28, 1754, they ambushed a small group of French colonial troops in the Battle of Jumonville Glen. The French retaliated a little more than a week later by attacking Washington's men at Fort Necessity on July 3 and forcing them to surrender. Although the 7 Years' War would not officially begin for another 2 years, these small skirmishes in the backwoods of North America formed the first clashes of a regional conflict known as the French and Indian War, and should be regarded as the spark that would ignite the broader global war that was to come. News traveled slowly in the 18th century, but reports of the fighting in the colonies finally reached Great Britain in August. Reports of the clashes varied greatly because of unconfirmed accounts of the events themselves, which led to sensational republications that blamed one side or the other. Such a lack of credible information was common for the time. Unfortunately, however, these poor practices continued to affect news and media coverage even in the 21st century. Fortunately, there is now a solution for breaking through the bias and reliability problems spread by global media, thanks to Ground News. We truly believe in their mission to help readers understand the headlines through diverse reporting, and we are very pleased to say that they are the sponsor of this video. Ground News gathers related articles from around the world in one place and provides context about the reporting source, such as whether it has a political leaning or even who funds it, so that you can see through the chaos and think critically about the information you consume. Even conflicts today are vulnerable to reporting problems, depending on where you live and what political stance a media outlet takes, which is why this blind feature is so useful. It uncovers stories that each side specifically does not cover. So if, like us, you want to eliminate today's media bias in order to understand the complex world we live in better and more comprehensively, then go to Ground News. This is history, or scan the QR code on the screen to save 50% on the Vantage plan. A subscription not only supports an independent, non-partisan platform working to make the media landscape more transparent, but also supports our channel. At that time, a state of unofficial war existed between Great Britain and France, with neither side offering a solution to the escalating situation. Both nations sent troops to North America in anticipation of the coming conflict. The first major British action was the attack on Acadia on June 16, 1755, which was immediately followed by the expulsion of the French population from the entire area. In July, British Major General Edward Braddock led about 2,000 soldiers and militia on a mission to retake Fort Duquesne. But the expedition ended in a catastrophic defeat, with Braddock himself mortally wounded. Further clashes led the British and French to confront each other in September of the same year in the inconclusive Battle of Lake George. Meanwhile, at sea, the British began disrupting French shipping. Admiral Edward Boscawen opened fire on the French ship Alcide on June 8, capturing it and 2 troop transports that were on their way to reinforce the colony in Quebec. The British also seized hundreds of merchant ships, captured thousands of sailors, and established blockades around French ports. All of this took place while the two nations were nominally at peace. France responded to these provocations in April 1756 by launching an invasion of the British-occupied island of Minorca in the Mediterranean. Great Britain finally declared war on France on May 17 and sent a naval relief force under the command of Admiral John Byng to relieve the besieged garrison. After an indecisive battle, Byng withdrew, and Minorca subsequently fell to the French. News of the failure to relieve the island caused outrage in Great Britain, and would ultimately cost Byng his life. He was later court-martialed for failing to do his utmost against the enemy, and the following year he was executed by firing squad. France finally declared war on Great Britain in June, although the main theater of war in Europe would not erupt until tensions between Prussia and Austria over the status of Silesia came to a head. The Austrians were determined to reconquer the territory, while Frederick the Great was determined to keep it. Having already secured his much-needed alliance with Great Britain, Frederick acted preemptively and invaded Saxony in August 1756, which at that time was allied with Austria and France. Frederick's grand strategy was to strike the Austrians quickly by advancing through Saxony and into Austrian territory in Bohemia, and to do all of this before a threat from Russia in the east could materialize. His plans, however, did not go as expected. At the Battle of Lobositz, on October 1, an Austrian force under General Maximilian Ulysses Braun managed to halt Frederick's advance. As a result, the Prussians were tied down and spent the next year trying to achieve a breakthrough in Bohemia. At the Battle of Prague, in May 1757, they came very close, but they were pushed back again in the following Battle of Kolin in June. With the Prussian army now concentrated against the Austrians, the French seized the opportunity to invade Hanover and occupy much of King George's German homeland. The Duke of Richelieu defeated the Hanoverian army, led by the British king's youngest son, the Duke of Cumberland, at the Battle of Hastenbeck in July. In the end, Hanover was effectively forced to surrender early in the war by signing the Convention of Klosterzeven. Meanwhile, in the east, Russian forces had mobilized and advanced into East Prussia under the command of Field Marshal Apraksin, taking the fortress of Memel. This wave of Prussian defeats forced them to retreat into their own territory, which in turn offered an opportunity for other anti-Prussian European states to exploit their now weakened position. Sweden then declared war on Prussia on September 22 and invaded Pomerania with 17,000 men. Toward the end of 757, Prussia found itself threatened on all fronts. Despite this seemingly hopeless situation, however, Frederick the Great managed to carry out a series of perfectly executed maneuvers that turned Prussia's fortunes around, and were nothing less than military genius. First, on November 5, he smashed a combined French-German army at the Battle of Rossbach, even though he was outnumbered by almost 2-1. The following month, he turned around and crushed a similarly numerically superior Austrian force at the Battle of Leuthen, further cementing his reputation as one of Europe's greatest military commanders. Finally, he turned north, drove the Swedes out of Prussian territory, and occupied Swedish Pomerania in the process. While the first salvos of the war were being fired in Europe, military events were also developing in India. The region was still largely ruled by the indigenous powers of the time, with the Mughal Empire in the north, the Sultanate of Mysore in the south, and the Maratha Confederacy in the central parts of the subcontinent. The British and French East India Companies had each established their own enclaves throughout the region, such as Pondicherry, Karamay, and the Coromandel coast in the case of the French, while the British held Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. The Battle of Plassey, fought on June 23, 1757, in northeastern India, was the first notable engagement of the conflict and had enormous consequences. A small contingent of troops of the British East India Company, led by a young officer named Robert Clive, together with several thousand Indian allies, defeated a 50,000-man army under the command of the local Bengali ruler Siraj-ud-Dowlah. The Bengalis were supported by a small French detachment, but they nevertheless suffered a catastrophic defeat at the hands of the British, who then established their control over the wider region of Bengal. After that, Clive and other company officials began aggressively expanding across the rest of the subcontinent. Although the French captured Cuddalore, their siege of Madras failed, which allowed the British, under Sir Ercout, to decisively defeat the remaining French forces at the Battle of Wandiwash in 1760. Pondicherry would later fall in 1761, effectively bringing about the decline of French influence in India as a whole. While the early phases of the conflict were unfolding in Europe and India, the war that had already begun in North America continued to gather momentum. The French initially gained the upper hand in the fighting by capturing Fort Oswego in 1756 and Fort William Henry in 1757. But after that, the superior numbers of the British began to make a difference. The colonial population of the 13 colonies amounted to about 2 million people by the late 1750s, while that of New France was barely 100,000. Once the first advances had been made and the British had mobilized the full support of their colonists, the French had little chance of emerging victorious. By 1758, the British had secured their western frontiers by capturing Fort Duquesne and Fort Frontenac, and had begun carrying the fight into the French colonies in Canada. The fortress of Louisbourg was captured in July of that same year, but not before the French managed to thwart a British land advance through upstate New York at the Battle of Carillon, which would prove to be the bloodiest battle of the war in the North American theater. This change in British military fortunes was largely due to the rise of William Pitt, the new Secretary of State in London. He proposed a strategy aimed at tying the French down in a costly land war in Europe by providing Britain's ally Prussia with immense financial aid, while the Royal Navy, together with accompanying army detachments, would be used to attack French ports in a series of raids known as descents. Attacks were carried out against the town of Rochefort in 1757 and against Cherbourg in 1758, but they had limited and mixed success. It was therefore decided to focus, instead, on France's more lucrative and exposed overseas territories. The French-controlled sugar-producing colonies in the Caribbean were incredibly valuable in terms of the revenue they generated for the state treasury. So much so that the two islands of Guadeloupe and Martinique were economically more valuable to the French than the whole of New France. In November 1758, 8 ships of the line were sent to the Caribbean with the goal of capturing Martinique. But after it was found to be too well defended, they sailed on to Guadeloupe, instead in January 1759. Although tropical diseases broke out and decimated the British troops, the island was finally captured in the spring, although it would take another 3 years before Martinique was taken. By this time, the war had also spread to the African continent after the British sent a flotilla in April 1758 to capture Fort Louis and the French slave trading stations in present-day Senegal. Back in Europe, the British government had managed to convince King George to ignore the treaty that had led to Hanover's surrender the previous September and to allow it to re-enter the war. Great Britain also sent about 9,000 troops to reinforce the Hanoverian army, which was now under the command of Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, who managed to drive the French out of the territory by the spring of 1758. In Eastern Europe, the Russians had taken control of East Prussia during the winter, and now threatened to advance farther west into Prussia's heartland. Frederick the Great assembled an army of 35,000 men to meet the Russians on August 25 at the Battle of Zorndorf. The engagement ultimately proved indecisive and extremely costly, with the Russian army under William Fermor unable to break through the Prussian lines, costing both sides more than 10,000 killed or wounded. The lack of a decisive breakthrough on either side in the war, however, would come to an end as a result of British efforts in 1759. The British knew that they could never match the strength of the French army on land, and, conversely, the French knew that they could not challenge the power of the Royal Navy on the high seas. Despite this stalemate, the French devised a plan for an amphibious attack and invasion of Great Britain, which would involve crossing the Channel with an army in flat-bottomed boats and landing on the south coast of England. William Pitt became aware of the French intentions and ordered the Admiralty of the Royal Navy to eliminate any possibility of invasion. As a result, in August of that year, a British squadron under the command of Edward Boscawen scattered the French Mediterranean fleet at the Battle of Lagos. Then, on November 20, at the Battle of Quiberon Bay, Admiral Edward Hawke attacked the French Brest fleet with 24 ships of the line, sinking, capturing, and forcing many of them aground, thereby ending the threat of a French invasion of Great Britain. The victory at Quiberon Bay came on top of numerous other French defeats in 1759. In New France, the British won a decisive victory on September 13 at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where about 4,000 British troops under the command of Major General James Wolfe clashed with a French force under Lieutenant General Louis-Joseph de Montcalm, Marquis de Montcalm, directly outside the city of Quebec. Although the British emerged victorious, Wolfe himself was mortally wounded in the fighting, as was the French commander Montcalm, who died of his wounds after the battle. The British conquest of Quebec paved the way for the further conquest of Canada in the following years, which ended the French Empire in North America as a whole. The year 1759 would from then on be known as the Annus Mirabilis, a year of miracles in British history because of the wave of successes it achieved over its greatest colonial rival. Despite the British successes in 1759, things were not going nearly as well for their Prussian allies. Defeats at the Battle of Kay in July against the Russians and the surrender of an entire Prussian corps of 13,000 men to the Austrians at the Battle of Maxen in November were highly damaging. But the greatest and most costly Prussian defeat of that year, which almost ended Frederick the Great's reign as king, occurred on August 12, when 50,000 Prussians faced a combined Austro-Russian army of 60,000 men, led by Ernst Gideon von Lauden and Pyotr Saltykov at the Battle of Kunersdorf. Both sides fought on difficult terrain, resulting in one of the bloodiest battles fought in Europe during this era. 40,000 soldiers were killed or wounded in this engagement, and the Prussian army collapsed into undisciplined chaos. Fortunately, Frederick was able to escape with some of his troops thanks to the fragile alliance between Austria and Russia, which manifested itself in the Russians not using their forces to pursue the fleeing Prussians. It therefore fell to the Austrians to exploit the victory at Kunersdorf by occupying Prussian territory. Although the first half of 1760 brought further defeats, with the Austrians winning the Battle of Landeshut in June and the Swedes recapturing parts of Pomerania, Frederick nevertheless managed to regroup his forces and hold his ground at the Battle of Liegnitz on August 15, 1760. There he inflicted a crushing defeat on Lauden's army, even though he was outnumbered by 3-1. By this point in the war, every government involved was feeling the strain of maintaining the fight over several years. From 1760 onward, the war entered a phase of stalemate, and although each side continued to field armies in order to achieve a breakthrough, most recognized that a major victory was not imminent. As a result, most attempted to disengage and make peace on the best possible terms. The only exception to this attitude came from Spain, which, although it was ruled by the House of Bourbon, the same royal line that ruled France, had so far remained neutral in the conflict. Things changed, however, in 1759, when King Charles III ascended the Spanish throne. He was more inclined to intervene in the war, especially after France had suffered major setbacks in America. Charles feared that if Great Britain could establish a more dominant positions in North America and the Caribbean, it would soon try to acquire Spain's possessions in the New World. So he began to adopt a more pro-French position, which by 1762 led to diplomatic tensions between London and Madrid that escalated so far that the British declared war on Spain. Portugal, an ally of Great Britain, also joined the struggle and then declared war on its Iberian neighbor. 3 major military operations then took place almost simultaneously in different parts of the world. First, in March 1762, a British expedition under the command of Admiral George Pocock set sail. It made its way through the Caribbean in April, gathering more ships and troops in the West Indies, before launching an attack in June on the Spanish-controlled island of Cuba. The British besieged Havana with about 30,000 men over a period of 10 weeks, before the city finally fell in mid-August. By then, another expeditionary force of a dozen ships and 10,000 troops under Vice Admiral Sir Samuel Cornish was approaching another Spanish possession on the other side of the world, the Philippines. After a brief siege, Governor-General Archbishop Manuel Rojo surrendered Manila to the British in early October. Finally, back in Europe, the Spanish and French had launched a joint invasion of Portugal in the spring of 1762. Yet, despite an immense numerical and strategic advantage, the Franco-Spanish army was repulsed by combined Anglo-Portuguese force on 3 separate occasions, the last of which took place in early November. Thus, by the winter of 1762, less than a year after Great Britain and Spain had gone to war, Spain had lost its most important city in the Caribbean, as well as the Philippines, to British forces. In addition, Spanish efforts to occupy Portugal, which should have been a relatively easy target, had failed, meaning that Spain had effectively been defeated in only 10 months. The other major development of the year 1762 was Russia's change of alliance. The previous year, the Russians had managed to capture the port of Kolberg on the Baltic coast, which then allowed their troops to receive supplies by sea rather than over the badly overstretched land route. Then what? This shifted the balance of power decisively against Frederick the Great. Great Britain even began to speculate that a total Prussian collapse was imminent and urged Frederick to consider concessions in order to secure a more favorable peace. Then, suddenly, on January 5, 1762, the Russian Empress Elizabeth died, and with her disappeared the firm anti-Prussian stance that had dominated Russian foreign policy for the previous 20 years. Her death was followed in rapid succession by the accession of Peter III and then Catherine the Great. Both Peter and Catherine were German-born or German-raised rulers with strong German connections and sympathies towards the Prussian cause, which completely changed Russia's position in the war. Under Peter III's brief reign, Russia abandoned its Austrian ally and aligned itself with Prussia and Great Britain. By the summer of 1762, Frederick the Great had received Russian troop contingents and had secured a peace treaty with Sweden, changing the war in Europe. Frederick then went on the offensive and recaptured much of Silesia. The Russians now, under the rule of Catherine the Great, had helped Frederick recover lost territory and then withdrew from the war. In the long-standing British naval blockade of French ports had undermined the morale of the French population, and the recent withdrawal of both Sweden and Russia from the war, combined with Frederick's reconquest of Silesia, convinced King Louis XV that his war aims were no longer achievable. He therefore made peace with Frederick and withdrew the Prussian Rhineland, thereby ending France's involvement in the war in Germany. By the end of 1762, concerted negotiations were underway to end the wider war. They culminated in two separate peace treaties, signed within a few days of each other in February 1763. The Treaty of Hubertusburg concerned the war in Central Europe between Prussia and Austria and essentially restored each nation's possessions to their pre-war borders. 5 days before that treaty was signed, the Treaty of Paris had been negotiated between the French and Spanish on one side and the British and Portuguese on the other. There was no doubt that this was a clear victory for Great Britain, since France had ceded its territory in North America east of the Mississippi to Britain. The territory west of the Mississippi in Louisiana was handed over to Spain in exchange for Britain receiving Florida. French colonies in the Caribbean were nevertheless restored, proving how valuable they were when the choice was between giving up control of New France or ceding Martinique and Guadeloupe. The terms of the treaty were less clear regarding India, although the British East India Company was now clearly the dominant foreign power in the region. The French, however, retained a small presence on the subcontinent, which would remain for the next 2 centuries. Apart from the territorial changes, the conclusion of the 7 Years' War led to broader political and socio-economic developments that would shape the remaining years of the 18th century. All nations were practically bankrupted by the war, although Great Britain in particular had to recover the costs it had spent defending the 13 colonies. As a result, a new tax system was introduced to raise state revenue in North America. This, however, angered many colonists because they had no political representation in the British Parliament and could not legitimately present their grievances. Within 12 years, the American colonies had erupted into open rebellion, and after witnessing British successes in the previous conflict, many nations in Europe now saw Great Britain as a greater threat than France. When the American War of Independence became a larger international conflict between 1778 and 1783, Great Britain found itself to fall alone against a coalition of nations determined to restore the balance of power